Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura.
And I'm Tom, really hoping that the third time is the charm.
And this is episode number 16. And as Tom noted, this is the third time we are trying to record this. We've had some issues with our recording platform, so that's been very challenging over the last week or so, but we've switched platforms and hopefully now we can actually record this episode in full.
If you're hearing this, that's a good thing. That means we didn't have to do a fourth one.
Even though this is the third time we are recording this episode, I'm really still very excited for it. And I can't wait to tell you about our topic today, which is Action Park.
Baby, let me take you where the action's hot. Action park. You can ride the excitement and feel the park ride. Action park. The action never stops at Action Park.
Looking for a great place for the family this summer? Well, Action Park has 75 of the wildest, wettest family rides in the world just minutes away.
The action never stops at Action Park.
Now, Action Park was an amusement park and a water park in northern New Jersey that has a reputation for being one of the most wildest amusement parks in the U.S., if not the most dangerous one.
MTV was also there with Allison Janes. I just found that out 2 seconds ago.
Really?
If you look it up on YouTube, the second video on YouTube is MTV shows up with Allison Janes at Action Park.
Part of the reason I'm excited to tell this story is that, like many of the guests at Action Park, I have a lot of good memories from my childhood from going to amusement and water parks. I would go a lot with my family to Six Flags, and I remember one of my favorite ones growing up was this Batman ride, where it was essentially just a normal roller coaster. I think it's one of the ones that, you kind of hang from the top of the track. And Tom, I know that those aren't your favorite roller coasters.
No, they are not.
But as you're waiting in line and you kind of have to climb through this building to get to the top to get on the roller coaster. And it's all themed with Batman and there's different things playing over the loudspeaker. And I just remember it being really cool. And it's almost felt like you were part of it and you were in Gotham. And it was just really, really cool. So that was one of my favorite ones. And then Tom, I also know that you have a bit of an adverse reaction to this other ride that I remember very fondly, I guess you would say. It was called Stuntman's Free Fall, where essentially I think it was like 2 to 4 people at a time would go up in this metal box, and you would go up about 2 or 3 stories in the air, and then they would kind of push you out over this track, and you just hang there for a second until you hear this buzzer, and then you just drop straight down and along the track, and then you kind of wind up on your back when you're done. To me, the most anxiety provoking part was waiting for that buzzer, because you're just in the air for a second and you know what's going to happen and you're just waiting for this buzzer to happen. I always really liked it. I don't think that it's still there now, but Tom, that's probably one of your worst nightmares, right?
For me, the words metal box and free fall should not be next to each other.
I know last time we recorded this, you pulled it up on YouTube. You had quite the reaction to it. Yeah.
My reaction is still the same. It's still nope. No.
Another really popular ride at Six Flags at the time was called the Scream Machine. And it was essentially 7 360-degree loops. And it was fun. It was a lot. You definitely could get nauseous after that, but it was definitely one of the ones that people tended to go to Six Flags for. There was also a safari there where you could kind of drive through it and see all the animals. That was really cool. And then they also kind of backed up to this lake where they had water shows and people that were water skiing and doing these tricks. And it was just, as a kid, it was really fun to go to. And I also remember going to Dorney Park and Wildwater Kingdom. I remember a lot of the wooden roller coasters and the wave pool at Wildwater Kingdom. So that was another one that I frequented more so with my friends.
So obviously I used to go to Disney a lot when I was a kid. So I am very, very fond of early 90s to 2000 Disney. That is very much kind of my happy place as a kid. And I remember just constantly going there and loving it. The first real roller coaster I ever went on was actually at Hershey. It was the old wooden dueling coasters at Hershey, which I think are closed now. But that was the first one I ever went to. There was one maybe about a couple miles from me, like a little neighborhood amusement park with like, like the wild mouse coaster, the one that's like the mouse trap and it just like slowly like zigs and zags its way down with maybe like a little dip. I do remember that, but I don't think I ever went there after I was like 5 or 6.
You mentioned Hershey, and we definitely went there as a family when I was younger, more so when I was like really little. And I remember Chocolate World and a couple of the roller coasters, and it's definitely it's a smaller amusement park than I would say like a Six Flags or Dorney Park.
Plus, you can get absolutely just hopped up on chocolate.
That's the bonus, yeah. And then the last one I wanted to mention from my childhood was this local water park called Waterworld. And Action Park actually reminded me a little bit of it, although I think that this one was much safer than Action Park. I don't know about you and where you grew up, but where I grew up, it was either kids went to the YMCA for a water park or the swimming pool, or they went to Waterworld. Waterworld had a couple of different slides. It had this one like very long, windy one called the banana slide, and you could go either single person or two person on this tube down the slide. And then they also had this shotgun slide where it was these very short white slides with a big rush of water that essentially like shot you out into the pool like a shotgun. And then there was the rope swing, which you had to like jump on this rope and like swing out into the middle of the pool and you drop down. Now, the only real way you would cause injury is if you didn't let go and you would come back and swing and hit yourself against the deck, which wasn't optimal, but we'll see. There was something similar in Action Park that was definitely a lot more dangerous the way they had that set up. But it was such a big part of my childhood. Like, I remember being there on summer days and going to the snack bar. And I have this very distinct memory of standing in line for the banana slide with my tube. And I could hear Bryan Adams playing over the loudspeaker in the park. And it just, if that's not late 80s, early 90s, I don't know what is.
So, first of all, if I'm ranking Waterworlds, that Waterworld has to be first. Second is Waterworld: The Bride at Universal Studios. And the distant third is Waterworld, the actual movie, which is absolute dreck. The only thing that's missing is just having like a can of Coke or just one of those like little, what were the little plastic like drinks, the ones with like the caps, the tops that you had to like snap off, the
Oh,
plastic
yeah.
top, and then with like the little, they weren't the Kool-Aid squeezers, but it was like in that type of bottle.
Do you remember the hugs? They almost look like little grenades, and you had to peel off that top.
The barrel jug, the plastic barrel jugs. So you had the plastic barrel jugs, you had the little squeezy top drinks, you maybe had a firecracker ice pop or one of those frozen ices. That's a quality summer day right there.
It was. So as you kind of feel, there's a lot of nostalgia when we think back about amusement parks and water parks, especially for us. I think especially for these decades, the 80s and 90s, before the internet, before cell phones, before kids were distracted by technology. Like, this is how we had fun. But it's a very nostalgic thing. And I think that the guests of Action Park felt the same, although we'll get into it, but it was very unsafe and a lot more unsafe than anybody really knew at the time. So in order to understand how Action Park got its reputation, we have to start at the beginning. In the early 1970s, Gene Mulvihill thought himself to be a successful Wall Street mogul, a Gordon Gekko type before Gordon Gekko was a thing. And he was, until he wasn't. Gene owned an investment company called Mayflower Securities, which mostly invested in penny stocks that were part of numerous pump and dump schemes. Gene was defrauding his investors for years until he finally got caught and was suspended by the SEC. He never served any jail time, but it was time for Gene to move on to his next venture, and that he did. In 1976, Gene, his business partner, and a few former investors formed a new company, Great American Recreation, and decided to buy a skiing area called Vernon Valley in Vernon Township, New Jersey. The ski slopes were frequented by nearby residents in the wintertime and was fairly successful. Looking at the massive piece of land that they bought, 250 acres to be exact, Gene quickly realized that he could make money in the summertime too. First came the construction of the Alpine Slide. It was a long, winding slide where guests would ride these like sled, scooter, go-kart things. Soon after, a water slide was constructed on one of the ski slopes, and the park began operating under the name Vernon Valley Summer Park. Gene could now see his vision of constructing an amusement and water park coming together, one big enough to compete with Disney World. In fact, Gene Mulvihill not only wanted to be the Walt Disney of New Jersey, he wanted to create something bigger and better, something that was like nothing ever seen before.
I should tell you the first 2 times I recorded this, there's at least 10 minutes of me laughing. This is the first time I've gotten through the phase.
It was a solid 10 minutes, everybody. Solid 10 minutes of Tom laughing. Now here we go again. I think the audacity of him that he thought that he was going to be the next Walt Disney, and especially everybody that knows kind of like the Northeast US, Jersey has its own reputation, and it doesn't really elicit feelings of like Disney World to me. I don't know about you.
No, it elicits feelings of drivers angry that you're not going 135 in the left lane, but not Disney.
No, definitely not. So 2 years later, on May 26, 1978, Action Park was officially open to the public. Now, Gene's approach to recreation was not conventional. His attitude was that anything goes. The guests were in charge because they are the action. It should be fun at all costs, and pointed to skiing as an example of the autonomy and control he envisioned for his amusement park rides, which I do get that analogy. I don't know about you. I used to ski a little bit when I was younger, when I was probably back in middle school, high school, and I do understand what he meant by the autonomy and control. They essentially give you the equipment if you don't have the equipment, and you have as much or as little fun during the day down the slopes as you want to. Do you know what I mean? So I get that analogy.
You know, they give you the equipment, they give you these old busted skis. You know, they give you the ones in the back that, you know, have been worn down to a nub. And then one or two things happen. You either become the person with like the 10-year clump of lift tickets on your zipper, or you're like me, you had to literally crawl up the hill because you kept sliding backwards and unable to stop.
I was always terrified to get off the ski lift. I always thought I was going to like bust my face, but never did. But it was a lot of anxiety. I remember like coming up to it, like, oh my God, am I going to get off right? But yeah.
You don't know fear until you start seeing the ground move behind you and you're facing the wrong way. And then you're on the buddy hill, but it empties into a bigger hill.
I imagine that that's not pleasant.
No, it leads to a lot of just flinging yourself on the ground in order to get yourself to stop.
As he was constructing Action Park, Gene hired ride engineers that had very little experience. Some were even previously blacklisted from working at Six Flags or Disney World because of their poor designs. The ride ideas could be a bit over the top to begin with, and Gene would change their idea to make them even more extreme. He would continue this with new rides that were added throughout the park over the years. At its peak, Action Park would draw 1 million people per year and boasted 75 rides and water slides. Where you're the center of the action and there's nothing in the world like Action Park were among popular ad slogans. It was marketed as having one of the first modern water parks, but also later became known as one of the biggest and deadliest. So there was certainly nothing in the world like Action Park. That is a true statement.
And people say there isn't truth in advertising.
At the time, there were little to no safety regulations for amusement and water park rides. This allowed ride engineers to construct the rides quickly and keep things more cost-effective for Gene. Ride safety was tested by park employees, and it was largely trial and error. Employees were offered cash to try new rides, and after a few rides with no injuries, it was open to the public. That's a way to test ride safety.
Because a few could be anything. A few could be can be hundreds of times. A few could be 3.
And I think it probably was closer to 3.
I think we can all assume it was closer to 3. It probably was exactly 3. We had a 66% success rate. That's good enough.
So ride safety was not the only issue at Action Park. Gene employed mostly teenagers, some as young as 14 years old, as ride supervisors and lifeguards with very little training. Being so young, they could be just as crazy as the park goers. Alcohol was also served at the park and was often given to minors, including some of the minor employees. Injuries were frequent at Action Park from the beginning. It took a while for Action Park to get a reputation for being dangerous, and for a period of time, it actually drew guests to the park to check out the experience for themselves. Now, I want to get into some of the rides and water slides at Action Park, and I really think as we go through these, you'll get a better picture of why it had the reputation that it did.
I also think, too, maybe the reputation was delayed because we're talking, the mid to late 70s? And there's no internet, there's no social media. It's all just kind of word of mouth and whatever you're seeing maybe on the news. Like, I do kind of feel like this place would have become like an internet meme had it existed after 2004.
I would agree with you, and I think that the lack of social media did really hold up how its reputation spreading. I think if this were today, Action Park would be shut down in 3 days because of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Yeah.
Well, it would have been shut down, but also a lot of people would have probably gone ironically.
True, and that's what happened here to some degree, but yeah. The park had 3 main sections: the Alpine Center, Motor World, and Water World. It also had a monorail and a German brewery, and hosted live shows and festivals, including a Dolly Parton lookalike contest. Problems first started in the Alpine Center with a ride called the Bailey Ball. Now, you remember this one from the first 2 recordings.
If you go on YouTube, there's you'll explain it.
There's a really funny animation on YouTube, so we highly recommend you go check these out. And for some of these rides, we're going to have the visuals on our TikTok and Instagram, so please go check those out. You really have to see these to really understand how crazy these rides and water slides actually were. So highly recommend that you guys go check that out on our pages. The Bailey Ball was this giant metal ball on wheels that rode along this winding track made of PVC pipe. One hot summer day, during a quote-unquote safety inspection, the PVC pipe expanded and collapsed, sending the ball off the track. Now the ball kept going, with the ride tester still inside, down a hill to the parking lot, across the highway, and into a swamp. The rider only sustained minor injuries, and the ride was never open to the public. This was really the first, I think, red flag of the park. You have poor construction, you have poor safety testing, and this ride tester could have been killed. Luckily, he wasn't. This kind of baffles my mind. And it's like, okay, well, let's keep going. Let's try other things.
No one figured out that plastic expands in heat.
Like I said, the engineers, they were blacklisted from Disney and Six Flags, so they weren't the brightest.
But even despite all that, that's simple physics.
Mm-hmm. Physics is a problem throughout Action Park, yeah.
And if you look at the animation, you see a giant ball with wheels on it that looks like the Titan submersible, just rolling down hills with the children pointing at it as it rolls down the hills across a highway. Imagine driving down and just, holy shit, there's a ball just bouncing up and down on the Jersey Turnpike.
And you're right, it does look like some kind of submersible. I want to say more so from the 80s, obviously. And the weird thing about this is it didn't just have wheels like on the bottom where it connected with the track. It was kind of like all over. So I think it was like rolling along the track, but please go check it out on our social media. It looks very, very creepy.
And like, first of all, you gave it momentum because you put it at the top of the frolicking hills of North Jersey. And then secondly, you designed a thing. James Cameron probably saw that and just spit up his lunch. We need James Cameron to design some of these rides because he would do it better.
Remember the Alpine slide I mentioned in the beginning? The first ride that was constructed about 2 years prior to the opening of Action Park? Well, it became notorious as arguably the most dangerous ride in the park for all the injuries that were incurred, the most ever for one ride at Action Park. In one documentary showing footage of the park, you can see handwritten warning signs for the Alpine slide with a notice to sign a release form and that no refunds would be issued for the ride, which huge red flags right away. And you remember from the last 2 recordings we did of this episode, the pictures of what this looked like? So essentially, riders would fly down this 2,700 foot long, like U-shaped track or slide that was made of concrete, fiberglass, and asbestos. And you had these like rickety carts that would fly down with this like really shoddy brake system. So it was either described as going like really, really slow or like uncontrollably fast. The problem was that the slide was not designed to keep you on the track. And if you didn't know how to navigate it, you were likely to fly off. Some of the turns were very tight, and coming down at a fast pace with the failing brake system would result in severe abrasions, broken limbs, and concussions. Not to mention the burns that riders would get from their skin making contact with hot concrete. Injuries from the Alpine slide were a daily occurrence. Would you ride down the Alpine slide?
No, not unless I had my affairs in order.
What immediately struck me about this ride was the fact that it was concrete. Like, just looking at that alone, I'm like, that's going to be a problem, let alone the lack of braking on these cart things that, would essentially send you flying off the edge of it.
Put aside all of flying off the track for a second. It gets hot in New Jersey in the summertime. So when the sun's beating down, now you're landing on concrete. You're going to get a freaking burn that says, like Girardi concrete and metal on your ass.
Not only the burn, but like the scrapes from like the skin scraping the concrete.
Listen, take it from somebody who had to wear pool shoes in the pool because he kept getting his feet scraped in the bottom of the pool. It's not fun. That's the type of nerd I was growing up. I needed the pool shoes.
Now, riders themselves also added to the danger. They would have to ride this like ski lift holding their carts, up to ascend to the top of the slide. Some of these asshole riders would intentionally drop their carts on unsuspecting riders that were coming down the slide, just for fun. To make things worse, there were these large rocks positioned around the track that would cause the most severe injuries. A 19-year-old man died in the early 1980s after being thrown off the track and hitting his head on one of the rocks. Gene Mulvihill, in an effort to minimize his and the park's responsibility, said that the man was an employee of the park and rode down the slide at night and when it was raining, none of which were true. The man's family sued Action Park and later settled for $100,000.
That is just beyond unconscionable. A massive red flag already of how this park is run. I mean, that's just, you shouldn't go to a park with the expectation that you're going to lose your life.
I really think this gives a little window into Gene's thought process and intention and the lengths he would go to keep the park going.
It's one thing to have an ideology. It's another thing to harm people in furtherance of that ideology.
Years later, hay bales were added to catch runaway carts and to avoid serious injuries. In its last year of operation, riders were required to wear knee pads and helmets, which way to wait till the last year of the ride being in operation. And why was this ride open for so many years? Especially after one kid died. I mean, we're going to see that this is a pattern for Gene in Action Park, but there are red flags all over the place here.
Oh, absolutely. And probably wouldn't have made it a year in other countries.
Employees talk about this shady infirmary that kids were sent to treat minor injuries. Their wounds would be sprayed with this orange liquid that was a combination of alcohol and iodine. And kids had to stand in this small circle while getting sprayed. And employees would take bets on if the kids would be able to stay in the circle while screaming in pain after being sprayed. It's said that only a handful of kids could actually stay in the circle during this process. This is a game. This is a sick game based on the kids being in pain. And that's
something out of friggin' Marathon Man. You know, it feels like Marathon Man with Laurence Olivier there performing the experiment. I mean, that's sadistic.
The Alpine Center also housed a skate park, which generally looked like any other skate park at first glance. Skaters quickly discovered that the poor design of the edges and the concrete between the valleys, or bowls as they called them, would cause frequent injury. The skate park was only open for one season, and it was later buried in dirt to forget that it ever existed. So that's how Gene handled problems, just bury it and forget that it existed.
Just like Jimmy Hoffa.
The last attraction in the Alpine Center I want to tell you about is the Gladiator Challenge. American Gladiators was a show that was hugely popular at the time, and Action Park offered the real-life experience. Guests would race through an obstacle course, and the fastest one to go through would go on to joust with a gladiator. Now, most of these gladiators, it was said that they were found and hired from local gyms. So real meatheads, it sounds like, were being hired for this role.
If anyone in our audience loves wrestling, especially loves wrestling in the heyday of it, the late 90s, early 2000s, you'll remember the wrestler Scott Steiner, aka Big Papa Pump. And well, he looked exactly how his name sounded, with the muscles all the way out about 10 inches in each direction. There's no other way I could describe it. Literal beefcake of a man. And now I can only imagine them with the Jersey Shore haircut fighting little Timmy from Hoboken in a gladiator style fight to the death. Are you not entertained?
Now, some guests did enjoy the experience, but sometimes it led to real violence. In one instance, a man who lost to a gladiator who he said was too strong to have a fair fight with later returned for retribution, which led to a brawl involving dozens of people. The police had to be called to respond to the situation. Can you imagine the chaos that was that day at Action Park?
Could you imagine how many Budweisers he had to crack to get the courage to decide, I'm taking this gym brat to the streets?
I'm sure there was a lot of alcohol consumed that day, not just by him.
It's not a fair fight. Of course it's not. That's the understatement of the year.
Now, let's head over to Motor World, which had its own set of problems. The first problem was that Motor World was located right next to where most of the food and alcohol were sold. Naturally, guests would throw back a few and then hop on nearby motor rides. These rides were mostly self-operated, and some guests, mostly men, would drive off course or intentionally exceed the speed limits. The perfect example of this was the Super Go-Kart ride. The go-karts were these single-seaters that raced around a concrete track. It was never a well-kept secret on how to override the speed limitation. Some employees would disable the speed limit mechanism on the go-kart, and guests would use a tennis ball to disable the speed limit mechanism to go up to 2 times faster. It was essentially described as like bumper cars, but at 50 miles an hour.
If these are complex machines, how are they defeated by a tennis ball?
They weren't that complex, I don't think. It was Action Park.
Also, too, like, you would think there has to be some sort of security here. You think after a while they would start, like, searching people for tennis balls?
We'll get to that in just a second, where they got those tennis balls. Unsurprisingly, there were a lot of crashes that led to a lot of injuries. Drivers would also be made sick by the petrol fuel coming from the go-karts. I imagine there was a lot of throwing up between the alcohol and the petrol fuel and the bumping into each other. I feel like there was a
And the
lot.
head trauma.
And the head trauma, that too. One of the most popular attractions at Motor World was the battle action tanks. Guests rode these cage tanks equipped with tennis ball cannons around a fenced-in area for about 5 minutes at a time. There were also cannons on the perimeter of the fence for outside guests to shoot tennis balls as well. So what could go wrong? Employees said that this was the worst ride to work because tanks frequently broke down or got stuck, as they would disable for 15 seconds after being hit with the tennis ball. The employees would be constantly running out to help dislodge or move the tanks, and they were also being pelted with tennis balls themselves. This ride was said to be more dangerous for the employees than the guests, and newbie employees often got assigned there as kind of an initiation to working in Action Park. Now, I can imagine that it was pretty chaotic between all the balls flying around and then the tanks like stopping for 15 seconds and the employees running out and then people around the perimeter shooting at the employee. Like, I imagine this one was absolute chaos. And where they got the tennis balls to, disable the speed limit mechanism on the go-kart. So it goes hand in hand.
Like, I've seen the pictures of this. It looks like one of those golf court cages thing that collects the balls. If you have a ride that you can shoot tennis balls at this thing, and then you have a bunch of people hopped up on alcohol and then give them weapons and projectiles, what the fuck did you think was going to happen?
Again, this is Action Park. This is a different class of fun. So one day, one of the guests riding the battle action tank took things too far. He decided to douse the tennis balls with gasoline and then light them on fire before shooting them out of the cannons. Needless to say, he was banned from Action Park after that incident. Like, can you imagine these like flaming tennis balls just being shot around this little fenced-in area? Wow. What a
Fucking
time.
Molotov cocktails.
Pretty much, yeah. That would have been a sight to see. Also in Motor World was the speedboat ride, where 8 boats at a time raced around a pond. Guests couldn't tamper with the speed of the boats as they could on the go-karts, but they still maxed out at a speed of 45 miles per hour. There were many collisions and capsized boats as guests fell into a snake-infested pond. One guy who was heavily intoxicated had to be rescued from drowning after he capsized. So he almost drowned, and then he could have been like attacked by a snake. God only knows what else was in this water. So the ride was later modified to add bumpers and became bumper boats. It was allegedly safer than the speedboats, but the boats often leaked gasoline. So that was going right into the pond too. Could you imagine capsizing into this gas water combination?
With probably mutated snakes.
Mm-hmm. Tall riders also had a difficult time fitting their legs into the boats, and they often had to hang their legs over the sides. The frequent collisions led to some broken legs over the years. Action Park also had 2 aerial rides. The Space Shot, which was a drop tower that was opened in the last year of Action Park, and the Slingshot, where 2 guests were shot in the air on 2 bungee cords. Both attractions were very safe and were likely the safest in the park, which surprises me, especially with the Slingshot. Just knowing how little safety precautions that Gene and Action Park took, that this was inspected properly, hopefully, and that they were maybe they just got lucky.
They had to use actual bungee cords because they were out of rubber bands that day.
Maybe that's it. Maybe if Gene had his way, they would have used rubber bands for that ride. Now, our last stop is Waterworld, which is responsible for several deaths during the run of Action Park. The Alpine Center had the most injuries, while Waterworld was the most dangerous for the number of deaths that occurred there. Though Waterworld did have its fair share of injuries. As one of the first modern water parks, Waterworld had no shortage of unique water slides. Gene was always looking for new ways to entertain his guests, and his big ideas led to the most infamous water slide at Action Park, which was Cannonball Loop. With the design sketched out on a cocktail napkin by Gene, Cannonball Loop was an enclosed water tube slide at the top of several flights of stairs, with a 360-degree loop near the end, dumping into a small catch pond. Now you remember the photos of this and how cartoonish this looks?
I repeat, I am not a physicist. I don't pretend to be a physicist. I barely got a B in physics. Even I know that the way this thing was designed, this fucking Ricola horn from hell, that there is absolutely no way to get up enough speed to go around the loop without either getting stuck or literally just turning over and then face planting right on plastic and getting stuck at the top of the loop.
As the slide was being tested, test dummies were sent down and came out the other side either decapitated or missing limbs. Gene would pay employees, including his son, $100 for each time they went down the slide during testing. Gene's son actually wore full hockey gear during his first trip down the Cannonball Loop, so he was aware of how crazy and dangerous this was. His own son, which blows my mind.
You send your son down there and
Yeah.
not you?
I don't know if Gene could fit down the slide, to be honest with you. He wasn't a small guy. After a few tests with minimal injury, the ride was open to the public. Right away, there were numerous injuries incurred by riders of the slide. Riders were supposed to go down feet first with their arms crossed, but would end up head first at the bottom of the slide after flying into the catch pond that was one, too shallow and also too short. According to one documentary, the slide just takes you into this dark tunnel where you become airborne during the loop part and then flop down on the other side of it. So you're just flopping down on this plastic, this hard plastic. This would result in concussions, broken noses, back injuries, and lost teeth. One story mentioned how kids were coming out of the slide all scratched up, and they couldn't figure out what was causing this. It was later discovered that there were several lost teeth lodged in the top part of the loop, which was causing the scratches. So it's just weird as it is that you're getting scratched up by like somebody's lost tooth. But like the nightmares, if I was a kid that went down this and like knew this, I would have like nightmares of like these teeth just like embedded in this slide.
It's a fucking gauntlet, and also you don't know where those teeth have been.
After the continued injuries, kids had to be weighed and measured essentially before going down the slide. If they were too short or too light, they would not make it around the loop. And if they were too tall or too heavy, they would get stuck in the loop. Now, there was a trap door that was installed at the top of the loop that would be able to allow employees to go in and help get kids unstuck. Kids were also hosed off before going down the slide and given instructions on how to reduce injury. So it wasn't just like, enjoy the fun of the slide and hope you get a lot of giggles out of this. It's like, here's how to not die when you go down the slide.
First, we're going to hose you down like an elephant. Then, if you make it through, it's like a double dare. It's like the end of Double Dare. It's like the final physical challenge on Double Dare. If you make it through the gauntlet of molars, then you have to survive the loop. And if you don't face plant on the hard plastic and knock yourself out, or need someone to get the trap door out to get you out, then we're going to have you empty out into a pool at full speed in like an inch of water.
And if you do make it through, you win a Casio keyboard.
Well, it's better than like the cruise.
Yeah, I know how you feel about giving kids a cruise. That's from our game show scandal episodes. Cannonball Loop is definitely, to me, the most ridiculous ride at Action Park. Once I saw this is really the water slides they had. And it reminded me a lot of I have an older brother, and he's a very like mechanical mind. He likes to build things, and like when we were kids, he did his own like homemade slip and slide thing before slip and slide was like a huge thing. And he like tried to create like this pinball machine, and he was just very creative. So when I saw a picture of the cannonball loop, like this is absolutely something my brother would have done. So the obvious problem here, like you mentioned, is simple physics. There was not enough water flow or traction for one person to smoothly complete the 360-degree loop. Competent water slide designers later said that no one should have ever ridden down Cannonball Loop. It only lasted one season, and it was promptly closed and dismantled. I don't know if this was when they tried to reopen Action Park later or in a different park, but they essentially redesigned this idea a little bit. And instead of like the person going down themselves, like you had to ride in almost like this cart along the track, like which is the only way that you're going to get enough traction. It just defies gravity and physics. A simple engineer would have been able to figure this out.
Unless the drop is a straight drop, there's just no way you're going to be able to build up enough speed to like stick to the wall as it's going up as it does the loop-de-loop.
Next up is Action Park's infamous wave pool, also nicknamed the Grave Pool. The wave pool had machine-generated waves, as did most other water parks' wave pools. This one was designed a bit differently, though. Most other wave pools don't operate on full power, but Action Park's did. It had large, powerful waves, and instead of doing the normal interval of stopping the waves every 2 minutes, Action Park would keep the waves running for 20 minutes at a time, with a 10-minute break in between. Fresh water was also used in Action Park's wave pool instead of the normal hybrid mixture that would make swimmers more buoyant in the water. Action Park's wave pool accommodated about 1,000 people at its max capacity, which was way too many people for the size of the pool. The waves would often sweep guests out to the deepest end, which was about 8 feet deep. Shoulder height depth was known as the quote-unquote death zone, and the closest lifeguard stand to this point was also known as the death chair, as many people either couldn't swim or were bad swimmers. There were 12 lifeguards on duty at the wave pool, and they would put wristbands on kids with CFS written on them for can't fucking swim. Some kids who supposedly couldn't swim thought that the magic of Action Park would make them know how to swim, which that's a dangerous little fantasy there, isn't it?
Well, that's like, when you see a toy on the commercial and you think it's going to look like one thing, and you get it out of the box and it's definitely not that.
Like, I can't really fault the kids for this because it just seems like it was just in their own imagination, but that's just so dangerous. Again, there's so many things here that are just so negligent.
Well, and it's also not the kid's job to know, like, what's safe and what's not. That's why you have actual adults in charge of things.
Didn't sound like there were a ton of adults here, though, especially the lifeguards, like I said, were mostly teenagers. So it just, again, was a recipe for disaster. In the span of 30 to 45 minutes, anywhere from 3 to 5 people would need to be rescued by a lifeguard. An average of 30 people per weekend would need to be pulled out of the wave pool. It was often difficult to see swimmers in distress in the murky waters of the pool. Guests would also scramble to exit, climbing over and injuring one another. 3 people drowned over the years in Action Park's wave pool, 2 of which happened in back-to-back years. It said that some guests thought that almost drowning was part of the Action Park experience. I can't imagine that. It kind of goes along with like the kids thinking they could swim, but these are adults who know better. Almost losing your life. That's, join the fun at Action Park.
Cheating death and being part of a Final Destination film is not part of an amusement park's joie de vivre. It's not part of the ambiance.
It is not, and it shouldn't be. A few years in, Gene had the wave pool reclassified as a pool instead of a ride, which would have less requirements like how clean the pool would be and the number of lifeguards on duty. This is another window into his thought process and into his intention. I don't know at what point he did this, like how many deaths had occurred, if any yet, but I mean, either way, it's not great. He just did not care. He thought this type of fun was most important over people's lives and people's safety, and it's just really disappointing.
Well, and also, too, he's cutting corners.
He cut a lot of corners. Another attraction in Waterworld was the kayak experience, where guests rode kayaks down a whitewater course. Large underwater fans pushed the water to create this like whitewater effect. Capsizing happened frequently, and in one instance it led to tragedy. After flipping his kayak, a man stood on an exposed wire from a fan that had short-circuited, and he got electrocuted. He later died of cardiac arrest.
Like I keep coming back to, experienced people who haven't been blacklisted from Disney would know that exposed wiring in submerged water is not a good thing. Like, they would know there's probably a way to do it and not have a bunch of live wires sticking out in a pool of water.
Well, I mean, you're thinking logically about this, though.
I don't have the action in me.
You don't. I guess we both don't. As bad as these engineers were at these ride designs, Gene made it worse. He had the final approval on these rides, and he made them more extreme. He cut even more corners. So I can't really fault the engineers as much. I mean, yeah, they seem to be really stupid, but I mean, it all, at the end of the day, this all lays at the feet of Gene Mulvihill.
Well, and again, when extreme is a personality, this is the result.
Gene said that state regulations cleared him of all responsibility for the man's death, but the incident led to the ride being shut down permanently.
I'm not responsible, but in a completely unrelated matter, no one can go on the ride ever again. There was no ride here. What are you talking about?
Kind of like the skate park where they just buried it in dirt. I wonder if any kind of like safety board or the state of New Jersey like forced him to shut down the ride. I know he didn't do it on his own. Next up, the Colorado River ride was similar to the kayak experience in creating the whitewater effect. Gene wanted guests to have a realistic whitewater rafting experience. The ride had guests on tubes of anywhere from 2 to 4 people down the slide, and they were often coming dangerously close to falling over the edge of the slide. People would slam into the sides of the slide and bump into each other as they would get piled up at certain points on the slide. Sometimes that would result in fistfights among guests. The Colorado River ride was more dangerous than most guests were aware of, especially because the lifeguard chair was often empty. Gene said that he didn't want any lifeguards because there were no lifeguards on the Colorado River. This is your water park where people have died. You don't think to throw in some lifeguards up to make sure that everybody's good.
Your privately owned water park that is actionable and can be sued as a legal body in a court of law. You can't sue the Colorado River, but you can sure as fuck sue Action Park.
Moving on to the super speed slide, which was a vertical slide in which guests literally fell in free fall for a short period of time before actually touching the slide. The slide was very fast and it went up to speeds about 60 miles per hour. And they said that bathing suits would either come off or it would cause like major wedgies. Now, one kid flew off the slide one day and got seriously injured. There was a canopy installed to help bounce the riders back onto the slide. Again, the awareness, we're just going to throw a little canopy in there just to bounce him back on the slide. You know, why don't you fix the slide design? Why don't you dismantle the slide? Because it's too risky. It doesn't have to be this extreme.
We'll just create a nice ricochet action between hard plastic. I'm literally begging this place. I know they're probably run by people who think like science and physics are for dorks and losers and, socialists. But like, hire a high school physics teacher because literally half of these problems could have been fixed by a physics teacher or physician telling you, no, stop, don't do that.
Jean didn't want to hear that, though. Then there was the Tarzan swing, which guests would swing out over the pool and they would have to let go at the right time or potentially crash into a large slab of concrete on the other side. So this reminds me a lot of that rope swing that I had at the water park where I grew up. But like I said, you kind of just swung out over the water and there was nothing on the other side. Like you were going to drop straight into the water unless you, like I said, didn't let go and hung on and swung back and hit the deck. But like this was, your timing had to be perfect. Like there was so much potential for injury just around this little rope swing.
For people who didn't believe in science, they were asking their guests to do a lot of scientific calculation in a very short period of time,
Yeah.
which is what's the exact point I could jump and not end up like a Looney Tunes character running into the wall.
So if they did drop into the water was so cold in the pool that some people couldn't get out due to temperature shock. Some people became disoriented or forgot how to swim, and one man went into cardiac arrest after dropping into the water. Other guests sustained injuries by scraping themselves on the bottom of the pool or face planting, like right in on the water, which you and I remember as a kid that, that really hurts.
Mm-hmm.
There was also an observation deck for people waiting in line to take their turn on a rope swing. Up to 75 people could be waiting in line to watch others do flips or tricks off the rope, which was extremely unsafe and reckless. Other guests took the opportunity to flash others that were waiting in line. A couple honorable mentions as we leave Waterworld. There was also a diving cliff that was essentially, it was like this rock cliff, right? And people would dive off into one of the swimming pools below. And one, it would cause numerous dislocated shoulders, probably because how high it was. And it was also not well marked on the pool below. So jumpers would often intentionally or unintentionally jump and land on the swimmers below, again, causing more injury. Then there was Aerodium, a skydiving simulator. Now, this was run by a separate company, but it still had many accidents and injuries reported over the years.
Probably because the Bailey ball that still is roaming around the hills of New Jersey to this day probably ran into it like once a day.
I could see that. Now, as we mentioned, Action Park was a disaster waiting to happen. From the poor ride design to the lack of safety measures, the abundance of alcohol and underage drinking, and the poorly trained employees who were mostly still in high school. Action Park had to buy their own ambulances at one point to accommodate all the injuries and trips to the ER, which averaged about 6 people per day. There was a lot of fighting and lack of authority to prevent it. Others mentioned, not so seriously, but they mentioned how the food that was sold at the park was usually like really stale.
There was literally nothing about this park that was safe.
No.
Literally, getting a soda from the snack bar was cheating death.
You're not wrong. But, right or wrong, Action Park was something really special to a lot of people, and it became a cultural icon. Guests were drawn to the park initially by its energy and guest autonomy, and later they were drawn by the mythology of it. The more injuries that were reported in the paper, the more guests would come out of curiosity. Gen X kids would ride their bikes to and from Action Park, and their parents never knew where they were, as was the trend in the 80s. One documentary described Action Park as this weird combination of magic and horror, because you didn't know if you were going to have the best day of your life making good memories with your friends, or leave in a body bag. There's a lot of distance between those two options.
Those are two really opposite ends of the spectrum. One of them should be what you want to attain, and the other one really shouldn't.
And I think that one kids shouldn't have to think about potential mortality if they're going to an amusement park during the day. I just don't think that's something that should cross a kid's mind, first of all. And one of the videos that I watched about this, they made a really good point in that a lot of amusement parks and theme parks, they have the illusion of being dangerous, but they are very, very safe because they go through all these safety precautions and testing, and they respond very quickly and appropriately if something does happen. Action Park didn't have that. You know what I mean? It was dangerous as it looked. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know. But I get, again, like we said in the beginning, how we both have really good memories from the amusement parks we went to. Like it is something special. I just think this was more risky for kids going, you know?
It was different things for different people. And I don't think the families of anyone who died or got seriously hurt are going to remember this fondly. I think the people who were very fortunate to not have to worry about that are going to remember this probably very differently. I think it is why it's kind of lived on the way that it has, because it really does kind of elicit a lot of different opinions from people. It's almost like a performance art piece, if if you think about it, because it elicits a lot of different opinions from a lot of different people.
And I think there's a difference between people that lived through it and experienced it versus people that have just heard the story about it. There's different perceptions and there's different opinions about it, but it definitely, at the end of the day, has this lore to it, you know, again, good or bad. I watched the documentary Class Action Park on HBO Max. And I want to say, first of all, I didn't love the way it was structured. I think the story could have been told in a little more of an organized way. That's just my opinion. But if you want to hear people's firsthand experience from those who actually went to Action Park, this is a really good documentary to check out. Now, they interviewed comedian Chris Gethard, and he talked about how going to Action Park was a rite of passage for a New Jersey kid. You had to go and get your scars, and then you could talk about them with your friends, like veterans sharing war stories. The former employees talk about Action Park with nostalgia, but they also remember the recklessness and the horror of it too. They would save money that they found in the pools, and they would throw these after-hour parties that were legendary. They would stay overnight and sleep anywhere in the park they could find. Hooking up was very frequent among employees, as you can imagine, especially them being mostly teenagers. Now, anyone who wanted to work at Action Park would usually get a job, and usually this was a full-time job, no matter what their age. And you mentioned in our last attempt to record this about Gene maybe disregarding labor laws or having kids work so long at that age. And again, I'm not sure what exactly the labor laws were back then, but
I don't know what they would have been. I mean, I know there's a lot of kids who work in amusement parks, but I also don't know what hours they were working, and I don't know. I would think now those are very closely regulated in terms of what they can work and the type of training they have to get.
I mean, I don't put anything past Gene, honestly, but it was definitely, I think the laws were more liberal back then than they were today. I don't think a 14-year-old could or should have been working an 8-hour day, but I'm not sure what that looked like in like late 70s, early 80s. All the employees were given their opportunity by the man in charge. Gene, better known to most as Uncle Gene, was big, loud, and full of ideas, and he intended for Action Park to be intense and extreme. It was like his own little twisted social experiment, and there were essentially no rules. He had a bit of an even darker side to him as well. One time he used a cattle prod on a kid who snuck into the park without a ticket. Some say that this was staged to be an example to other kids who thought about sneaking in, but the cattle prod was very real, and the kid did get shocked. Though Action Park's problems would begin to catch up with Gene, especially as town residents would complain about the safety of the rides and the frequent injuries, he was able to buy himself some time by turning to his friends in high places. Some Vernon Township officials were on his payroll, and he even bought nice homes for some of them. There was this attitude among politicians locally and probably state and federally was, what can I get from Gene? Now, he was well aware of this and he was happy to oblige. He would do what he had to in order to keep Action Park going, including keeping a MAC-10 machine gun in his desk drawer. It was rumored that Gene also had mob ties, but that's never been substantiated. By 1986, Action Park had numerous safety violations. These included allowing minors to operate rides and not reporting injuries and accidents. Gene looked for every opportunity to get around the law and would only report injuries if someone needed to be transported in an ambulance. So who knows how many injuries there actually were at Action Park? We do know that there were 6 deaths and hundreds of serious injuries confirmed there. And for anyone who doubts the depths of Gene's heartlessness, he once said that the deaths at Action Park were statistically insignificant, basically making the argument that among all the millions of people that had attended Action Park, there was only a very small number of deaths, which just saying that any death is statistically insignificant is so heartless, like I said, and just so awful. I can't imagine how the loved ones of these people that died feel, or if they ever heard him say that. It's just this guy, like I said, if you ever doubt his intention, like that sums it up right there for me.
He was a jerk, plain and simple. He was an absolute jerk.
This goal of having this like extreme, crazy amusement park was so much more important than people's lives and safety. I mean, as we've said.
It wasn't just having this amusement park. It was this dream of having this. I can't even explain it at this point. It was just having this specific park was paramount to everything, including the safety of other people. He didn't care about anything but himself.
To make things worse, it was discovered that Gene was running an insurance scam as well. As the park was being constructed, Gene started his own insurance company called London and World Assurance because he didn't want to pay insurance premiums to a legitimate company. He insured himself and Action Park through his company and counterfeited documents to keep the scam going. He also started laundering money and running MLM schemes through the insurance company. This led to a state investigation in 1985, which would be the beginning of the end for Action Park. The investigation would lead to a 110-count indictment, and Gene would be charged with and plead guilty to fraud, conspiracy, and theft. He didn't serve any jail time, but was ordered to pay a total of $300,000 in fines. He also had to give up control of Action Park to the state of New Jersey, but Gene wasn't ready to throw in the towel on his dream just yet. Gene decided that he was going to stop paying rent on the land where Action Park was built, something that the state could apparently do little about. He forced their hand, and they agreed to sell him the land for $800,000, and his old colleagues from New York stepped in to help pay the tab. We talked about in prior recordings of this. I'm still a little confused on how he was able to pull this off. Like, if he was unable to pay the rent of the land to the state of New Jersey, wouldn't they just repossess the land then?
Especially if the state owned the land. Like, I don't know why they couldn't just evict them.
Yeah, I don't know how the law was written around this time, especially in New Jersey, but this just seems like, I'm just really surprised that their hands were tied, that they couldn't do anything, and he forced their hand to sell it back to him. I don't know.
If there are any New Jersey property lawyers who want to hit us up, slide into those DMs and give us a consult and explain how this could work. I'm more than happy to do that.
Unfortunately, Action Park would never really recover after Gene's conviction. After all the bad press, attendance plummeted in the late 80s, early 90s, and Gene struggled to pay the bills. One former employee talked about how U.S. Marshals would show up at the park pretty regularly to collect on unpaid taxes. By 1995, money was so tight that Gene operated the park that year without insurance, but it wasn't enough to save Action Park. Around this time, Gene's business partner was convicted of money laundering and bankruptcy fraud and went to jail, leaving the financing of Action Park up to Gene. he couldn't secure the funding from investors the way he used to, as they weren't willing to take the risks that they were in the 1980s. Now, I was very young in the 80s, and you were also very young in the 80s, but from what I remember and what I've been told, I feel like the 80s were such a decade of excess and things that were over the top and just a lot of money being thrown around. I feel like there was a lot of cocaine being done amongst adults, particularly probably in the New York, New Jersey area. The big hair, the colorful clothes, like it was a crazy decade.
I'm sorry, the way you said a lot of excess, a lot of people doing things, a lot of cocaine.
There was a lot of cocaine in the 80s.
Well, I'm not saying there wasn't a lot of cocaine. Basically, Miami basically created the cocaine trade in the 80s in the United States, but the 80s were very laissez-faire. People kind of did what they wanted to do, for better and for worse. A lot of worldviews were kind of built on that, if you think about it. And this was very symbolic of that, or this feels very symbolic of that.
And I think that's why, one, that Gene could get the financing from investors back then. They were a little more liberal with the way they were investing and probably how much money they were investing. And again, it just fits into this 80s vibe as like anything goes. And it not only was Action Park extreme, the decade itself was extreme.
And I would absolutely agree. I would absolutely agree.
In 1996, Action Park went into bankruptcy and closed at the end of the season that year on September 2nd, 1996. That wasn't the end of Gene's legal troubles, though. Some of the park's nicknames were, like I said, Class Action Park, Accident Park, Traction Park, or Friction Park. In total, Action Park had about 2,500 lawsuits over the years, and Gene would rarely settle. He would claim that guests were at fault for their injuries because they either didn't follow the rules or underestimated their ability to swim in rough waters. He would fight and draw every case if it meant that he didn't have to pay, and he won about 93% of his cases. What do you think about that?
I think he was probably very persistent, and I think he was very, very motivated to win because he knew the financial house of cards he was sitting on. He had everything to lose if he lost. My guess is he probably got around a lot of these in a couple of ways. One, the park was probably a separate legal entity, like something like a limited liability corporation, so that he personally could not be responsible, even though he is the owner of the park.
It's interesting you say that, because when I mentioned back in 85, when he had to pay that total of $300,000 in fines, that was split up between what he personally had to pay and what Action Park had to pay. So he had some responsibility in this financially.
They probably sued the park and him. What would happen in something like that is half of the proceeds would come from him and the other half would come from whatever the park's assets were. And he may have probably won a lot of them on technicalities. That would be my estimation as to what happened.
And I'm sure there were probably some plaintiffs that ran out of money themselves and couldn't afford to continue the legal battle, especially if he drew it out. So it sounds like he became really skilled at knowing how to get around the lawsuits.
Well, and the other thing, too, is when you're a plaintiff's attorney on that, you're working on contingency, meaning that the lawyers are not getting paid. No one's getting paid on the plaintiff side unless there's an award. I don't necessarily know if he was bleeding them out, at least not that I would think. I think more what's happening is he probably using kind of loopholes to get around it. Also, too, you said that he had a lot of friends in high places in the county. I don't know. There are some counties that tend to be more pro-corporate defendant than they are pro-plaintiff. Maybe that's what happened.
In 2010, Gene attempted to bring back Action Park, though with more safety measures. He would pass away in 2012 before he got a chance to reopen the park. Gene's son went on to reopen Action Park from 2012 to 2014 as a way to memorialize his dad. but with the park's notorious reputation in the decades prior, it did really poorly and closed after 2 seasons. Today, the park is known as Mountain Creek Water Park and provides safe, recreational fun for a new generation. All that is left of Action Park are the memories, the scars, and the grief of those who lost their loved ones. Now, as we talked about, Action Park could not exist today. It would be shut down prior to the closing of the first season. Now, there were safety warnings for some of these rides in Action Park, but they never made them readily available to the public. And the carelessness and recklessness of the entire operation is just astounding. Some argue that the bigger story of Action Park was the cover-up of all the safety problems rather than the safety problems themselves. And I can see both sides of that argument, but the bottom line is that the guests never really knew the extent of the full danger of Action Park's rides. For whatever it's worth, Action Park will always have a place in amusement park history for the legend that it was, good or bad. Now, just a couple thoughts before we wrap up here. As many of our episodes have been and the topics that we covered, everything is so nuanced. It's not so black and white. There's so much gray area in a lot of these topics and feelings on both sides of an issue, and Action Park is no exception to that. Like I said, I think for a lot of kids that attended Action Park, this was such a crazy, fun, out of control experience. And as long as they didn't get seriously hurt or died, it was like Chris Gethard said, it's a rite of passage. It was something that you bragged about, something that you talked about with your friends. And I can see from that perspective, why there are some good feelings about it. But if you're looking at this from a safety and liability standpoint, it is a fucking nightmare.
A fucking nightmare to say the least. And it's not a park that I would have ever stepped in.
I was going to ask you, and I asked you on the other attempts to record this, would you ever go to Action Park? Just to even see, not even maybe riding any rides, but just to see the spectacle that was Action Park.
If someone wanted to pay for me, then yes. But I wouldn't go on anything or eat anything or drink anything or touch anything.
Now, I was probably, I know that I was more of an adventurous kid than you were, but I remember being very cautious and very aware of safety when I was a kid. So I think I would have gone, but I think I would have been very selective about the rides that I would have went on, which probably I wouldn't have gone on most of them, but maybe some of the more tamer ones I would have tried.
Like the bungee into midair.
No, I wouldn't even do that at a safe park. And I don't hate heights.
That was the safest one in the park.
I know. So many things can go wrong with bungee cords that it just makes me nervous. I'm honestly surprised that there weren't more deaths or more injuries. Now, I'm glad that there weren't, and God only knows what was not reported, what we don't know about, but for all the negligence and lack of safety, how there were not more deaths is beyond me.
Even the ones we know about were too many.
And it's interesting because since we did our first attempt to record this, when I do my research, it often gets into my YouTube algorithm and I see some videos pop up that are related to the topic that I talked about. And there are a few videos in the last couple of days about other theme parks and amusement parks that had, rides breakdown or injuries or death. I did check out a few of them. And I think the running theme through all of those was that Action Park wasn't exclusive in terms of injuries and deaths, but their response at these other parks were much faster. Rides were shut down permanently after one injury, after one issue, after one safety violation. It wasn't allowed to go on and on and on like this. These were issues dating back to the early 1900s.
Well, and also too, if a park has safety issues while they're still working on a ride, if it has enough safety issues, they're just going to scrap the ride.
Tell us, guys, would you ever go to Action Park? Have you been to Action Park? If you have, let us know. We'd love to hear your experience with it. Do you have your own parks if you're in another country? You know, was that something that you did with your friends or your family? Is it really just a bigger thing in the US? Not really sure how it is around the world. Yeah, this is definitely an interesting one. I was very excited to talk about this. But yeah, I don't think this would ever happen again. And I'm just surprised it happened in the first place.
And if you've ever been to Euro Disney, let us know because I just want to talk to you.
Okay, guys, that's our show. Tune in next week for another episode. Tom will be covering something that was a bit of a national scandal. So if you enjoy our show, please give us a 5-star review, subscribe, and follow us on social media at the Tell Me About Podcast, and send us comments and episode suggestions to thetellmeaboutpodcast@gmail.com.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Bye.